Following on from our last session, I discussed motivations for coming to the Promised Land, to come to Israel and to settle in Jerusalem. The continuation of that is, what should I do here? And that took me a long time to understand. I went traveling. I was a rabbi in Naples and in Strathfield Synagogue in Sydney as I did my PhD on the Chabad movement, and was at Oxford University at the L'Chaim Society running a student organization, and then moved on to Cambridge to run a student organization, and then I did my postdoctorate in theology in Cambridge, and returned only to work on a platform for a political party, and then left again to continue my PhD, to my postdoctorate in Cambridge in political, legal, and religious insights into new methods of election, how to appoint a better type of leader, a better leadership, a better candidate to manifest the will of the best will of the people. So I looked at the upper chambers of Europe and the House of Lords and the second chamber in Ireland and in Scotland and at the European Union and different types of political organizations and religious organizations, and was struggling to find a solution for New Jerusalem, how to contribute to Jewish political thought and even universal thought, universal social, organizational, ethical, inspired thought. So I was very much inspired by religious thinking. I was ordained a rabbi in the Chabad movement in Kfar Chabad. Motivations for being a rabbi I will discuss another time. I was certainly inspired by the Messianic movement around Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Chabad Rebbe, and I wrote 2 books on the subject, and then began to think about new types of Messianic thinking and old types of Messianic thinking and utopianism, and the dynamics which have caused people to be so utopian and idealistic, and sustained and practical, and the dynamics of a 1,000-year reign, how logistical Messianism I called it, and started writing works, one entitled Messiah's Parliament or Messiah's Town Planners, and the idea that the Messianic idea is not necessarily a spiritual, religious, but rather a technical, practical ambition that its realization can be found in other places, not necessarily on the pews of the synagogue. So I decided to leave academia entirely, and I went to do a course in computer networks. That was in the year 1999. I came back to Israel and decided to leave all of these things aside and to delve into technology. I did so for a year, and I wrote a proposal for a way that I felt that the best practices of humanity can be distributed to everybody through a GPS and through mass digital distribution of knowledge, and to fulfill the Maimonidean ideal that in the Messianic times knowledge will cover the world like water over the seas, so for a year or two I was very much committed to this, and that was a time that the big companies like Google were emerging. And I worked with several colleagues on many different ideas, and then after a year or two I left again and took up a position as a, let's see, either it was in Australia, or then later on it was in Cambridge, and then later on it was in China, and maybe several other minor places for months at a time in between. So that after my time in China, I returned back to Israel, and having observed the utopian attempts, the failed and successful utopian attempts of the Chinese civilization, it gave me an entirely different perspective on what Israel should be looking at. And I began to appreciate that Israel should be looking at large geostrategic and infrastructure and national alliances, and about large technical projects with cooperation with its neighbors, space and hydroelectricity and energy and telescopy and a canal from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, and new geographic bridges, and 5G and satellite and communications and so on. So that these, whilst the new Jerusalem, an ideal place for civilians and citizens and individuals and imaginations and schools and learning and prayer and celebration, there also is a platform for incredible technical things, and even so that these technical opportunities were the very leverage, were the very mediums in which the ideal could be achieved in the first place. So that instead of looking at the universities or in the pulpit or amongst any idealist groups, I began to see technology as the way to achieve a utopia, to be able to create surplus for individuals, and to be able to be dependable, because just as one travels, one also realizes that the personalities of people and even oneself is so nomadic and so changing, and one's commitments and one's ideals and one's thoughts change over time. So and that probably has always happened. In fact, it certainly has always happened. And so that how does one create a sustained or a predictable or more accurate instruments to if one wants to do surgery on society, what instruments does one use? And then I got into a subject, and it was during the writing of a book called Theology in the 21st Century. Initially, I called it Jewish theology, or a vision for Israel in the 21st century. And then I realized that it's really a universal vision, and that it is about first understanding the instruments that we have at our disposal. And then I realized, or perhaps it was a cause or effect or a parallel event, that the biblical stories were really in many ways talking about these ideas, about the instruments, about the, in fact, the idealization of the instruments in the tabernacle. Is really a basic part of the biblical identity. The story, the narrative is about the idealization of 39 instruments which were built in the ark and we carried around. The children of Israel carried around, and eventually the temple was built to house them. It was a storeroom, a laboratory for the 39 instruments and the mastery of all this cycle. So then I began to develop a theology around technology, and then I began to listen to what I was saying, and then I realized that indeed this is so, that we can come about and bring about an incredible society for ourselves if we build the instruments that are necessary. And then the question then is, what type of instruments? And then it again comes to many ethical questions, and ethical questions that I didn't expect to have to address. But now that I ask myself certain questions, there are also certain answers and certain redresses that are required. What are the ethical challenges in building the instruments that are going to bring about our New Jerusalem? And how to ensure that these machines that will repeat themselves continually and that do not have the soul and the choices that we do, how do we assure it? And then another question comes to the fore, and that is the inadequacy of the bureaucracy. Because until now, the bureaucracy has caused so much of the travails. It is a hit or miss whether it works or not, and invariably, in many cases, it does not work. The bureaucracy, in many cases, causes more problems than it solves, so that it cannot be responsible for the training of the instruments which are going to bring about the great changes that we look so much forward to. The committees, the governance, these structures, bureaucratic structures that do not feel, are not sensual, do not have a soul, they cannot be responsible for the foundation of this. And this seems there seems to have been a takeover by the committees in the last 20 or 30 years. I haven't measured it, but now that I look back, and from the time that there was a personality behind in organizations and there was charisma, and now that there is in the attempt to be efficient, the authority was moved to committees, and they were decided in very stoic ways. Indeed, in many ways, they were efficient in some areas. But in the areas that are now required to train a future, which must be individual-centric and must reflect the greatest lessons that we have learned from the spiritual heritage and legacies and the cultural and the philosophic legacy. So then it occurred to me that this is more serious than I thought. That instead of being caught between one order or another, between one nationality or another, between Jewish, Christian, Islam, Israel, Palestinian, Arab, or Europe, one should look at the challenges ahead to all mankind and humankind. That bureaucracy is a structure that does not feel and can completely take over, and that it may end up being the challenge of religious people with heart, not even religious people, but secular people who understand the importance of a certain structure. I'm not saying an all-human structure, because I believe in the use of instrumentation, of technology. I strongly believe in technology. I just feel that the technology has to be built by people for people, and that first and foremost it is to solve problems and to mobilize the abilities of people, and it should not be driven by profit. Now, I understand that profit makers are those that will build these, but there needs to be in the structuring of society a quiet consensus. I say quiet because the alternative to quiet is loud, ugly, and difficult. That is a story expressed and a warning demonstrated in our traditions that reform can come with great pain, or it can come very quietly with a shift. And I hope that we can do it with a shift. A new layer has to go onto our technology that will reflect the greatest ideals that we have achieved in humanity, and the process of translating our humanity into digital form, all of our best practices and complex ideas and the needs to be rendered into a way that can be automated, and that humanity does not have to deal with the technical issues of its survival, but surplus abounds, and a new era can emerge where we can consider our horizons and our possibilities in many unique and different ways. Having understood that this is a episode that happens once in an eon, several thousand years, that we have achieved what people call the singularity, or nearly, that the way forward has to be in bringing the conscience reflected in many other good communities and families. This needs an expression in the instruments, and that many religious people and educationalists are neglecting the arena of high tech, of AI, of artificial intelligence and general intelligence, for the purpose of the individual. In fact, a lot of individuals are seeing this as their great threat, and indeed it is a threat if used by corporations against them. So that it seems that who is going to take up the struggle of the individual to reimagine a role for the church, for religion, for the spiritualist, for the mystic, for the individual who wants to explore their nature vis-a-vis the divine, who wants to roll in holiness, who wants to imagine. I began to appreciate religion and spirituality and the new possibilities to reimagine the divine, even in physics. My personal interest is in physics, in quantum mechanics. In many ways, I find myself more interested in the religious tradition in terms of its anthropological development, the circumstances in which it emerged, and how it represents the zenith of societies, and through the ritual signature that is left. And if one can interpret these ritual signatures, one can truly learn and be inspired or be directed what is the way forward. And I would like to break through the way forward for social thought and for the welfare of humanity, and for the welfare and the liberty and the exceptional expression and freedoms of every individual. That is in my blood. It's part of my passion. It's part of the my raison d'etre, and why I came to Israel to put my shoulder together with other brave pioneers to create a better place. A better place is not where any person dominates another person, or any bureaucrat, or where problems emerge from nowhere. The a better life is really, and again, where the Bible comes to its poetic self, that it really does express the life of happy people under their grape and under their fig tree, and enjoying life. And so the great challenge for me, whilst I may have come here full of idealism, now I believe that the great challenge is how to live a wonderful life. And once one knows how to do that, how to apply that to everybody, that everybody can live wonderful lives. So it's been an interesting ride. It's been lots of ups and downs, and my bet is with artificial general intelligence, combined with radical individual services, elimination of all problems, a mechanism where solutions are found for every problem, and that no person is left wondering. And that will be the platform for a new age for human ambition.